Okay, so now we're into the last part of the first lecture. I've broken this one up into parts to try to do reflective practices as I went, try to point out the highlights. In future weeks it'll just be me and maybe slides and so on, but I want to keep the file size much smaller. But I had this lecture from before and I thought it was worth reflecting on that with you, so hopefully you found it useful. Now this last little bit, just a couple of bits to finish off and then a summary, but I talk here about history, historical explanations again. They're important explanations to the dominant ones, the individualised great men theories of history, or explanations based on individual choice, or biological explanations. We'll talk about those a little bit later. I can't, of course, teach you the entire history of the world. I can refer you to some textbooks and online sites, but you know, for the next 12 weeks we're not going to be able to cover all of that. But a historical sense of things is important, and so I'm using a little analogy just to give you a bit of a context for human history called 800 lifetimes analogy, and then also a reminder that when I say history, history requires some uncovering too, because the matrix or society has its own historical stories that it tells. When it's not saying it's always been this way, it's got its own versions of history and what happened. So we need to be aware. We need to be aware of that, and you know, because that's part of the culture and part of the structure. So we don't find all the stories. Sometimes the stories are ideological. Then I finally do a final example, which is the population question. Now which I think brings together all that we've been talking about in the lecture. It's a critical issue. Human population, it'll be the first thing gets mentioned in most environmental science textbooks if you're doing that. But as citizens, we deal with environmental questions. We hear them all the time, and it's commonly said, there are too many people. People are the problem. You might even remember in the opening sequence with the Matrix, the agent says there that human beings are a cancer on the planet. I mean, that view is unfortunately not uncommon, and so I wanted to look at the population question and just bring a sociological lens to it, and then hopefully we can see you in the Moodle Cafe and you can tell me what you thought. Okay, talk soon. Bye. And so we need that sense of history, how it got to be this way. But remember, just like in the Matrix has a history already written into it. The people living inside the Matrix, who are stuck inside the Matrix and are really slaves, but think they're living a normal life, they get taught a history too. And that history is fed to them through computer screens and so on, so that they think they have a history. And in a way, society does the same thing. The society has dominant discourses about what happened in history. How did it get to be this way? Most often they are projections of the present set of arrangements back into the past, which serves to naturalise them. It's always been like this. I call it the Fred Flintstone version of history, that the Neanderthal man and prehistoric people lived in much the same way as we do now, but just with different technology. They lived in nuclear families. They would have had, if they'd had the technology, they'd have had cars. They just wouldn't have had a internal combustion engine, and they would go to work 9 to 5 the same way that modern people do, and so on. And all of that's just read back into the past. Now, it's kind of funny in the Flintstones, but it's surprisingly how often people sort of use those kind of stories to maintain that more or less it's always been this way, when in fact it's historically humans have lived in many different sorts of ways. So if we want to use arguments about human nature, we need to always keep our eye on the big picture. So one way to grasp that is to think about, if we compressed all of human history into 50, we say, look, humans have been around for about 50,000 years. Modern humans have been around for about 50,000 years. So let's think about that as 800 lifetimes. If everybody lives 65 years, that's 800 lifetimes. So the first 650 of those lifetimes out of 800, human beings lived in caves. They lived as tribal hunter-gatherer people who lived in a direct subsistence relationship to the land. Think of Indigenous people prior to white settlement in Australia. So for a very long period of time, human beings lived as tribal groups that were kin-related. They didn't have private property. They didn't own the land that they worked on.
or they didn't work the land, they hunted off the land or gathered off the land, and that food was then distributed around a kinship system of extended families with all sorts of cultural variations around the world, but as a generalisation we can say in that foraging mode of production, that was a very different way for human beings to live. A mode based on communal ownership of land, and communal use of the land, and sharing of the fruits of that land which nobody owned. It's only in the last 70 lifetimes that it's been possible to communicate in writing. So that's a very particular part of our culture, but that's only existed for the last 70 of those 800 lifetimes. It's only in the last 6 there's been a printing press, that we could mass produce words in ways that meant that reading became a much broader and more common skill in the population. And it's only in the last 2 that we've had electric motors. So most of what you use has been created in your lifetime. CDs, automatic telemachines, computers, iPods, right? All of those technologies, although they might have built on earlier ones, are essentially a product of this last lifetime. Our grandparents did not find it a common experience to drive in the way that we do. Our grandparents would have grown a lot of their own food or made a lot of their own clothes. There wasn't giant supermarkets. There were corner shops. There was no McDonald's, right? So a whole range of changes have occurred in the very, very recent past, the internet being the obvious one, the one you're probably watching me on right now. So I just work through one more example of this idea of the sociological imagination for people doing environmental science. The first point I'd make about environmental problems is that there are no problems to the environment. The environment doesn't have a problem, people have a problem. Environmental problems are really social problems. They, as Edmund Hillary said, they begin with people as the cause and they end with people as the victim. So before we start thinking about environmental problems, we need to think of them as people problems. Typically, environmental science looks at humans as part of the animal world, more evolved, sure, but while that is important to understand that human beings are animals, they are more than animals, and they don't operate in the same way that animal populations do. So it's common when we look at environmental problems, one of the key issues that's often identified is the issue of population. And so it's common in environmental textbooks to move from animal populations and competition over scarce resources between competing groups of animals to have diagrams where, you know, if the predator kills too much of the prey, their population declines. That means that the prey animal's population rises, which gives rise to a chain. So you get a cyclical process of predator-prey. Now, clearly that doesn't happen in human populations. We are, in effect, at the top of the food chain, and our population growth is heavily tied to economic growth. In fact, the biggest spurt of economic growth has happened since the Industrial Revolution in the 1830s, and we've seen startling rates of population growth since that time. But again, we could take the sociological imagination to this. We could think about our own biography. We could start with that. We could say, well, what if you'd been born in India or a third world country? How might your life have been different to the one you experienced as a person growing up in Australia or in an advanced capitalist economy? But again, if we step back and look at the social patterns, what's the history? What do we notice, for instance, that poor countries, for want of a better way of putting it, the third world or whatever terminology you want to use, the peripheral economies as opposed to the core global economies, what do those countries have in common? Well, one of the things they have in common is that they're all former colonies. So India is a poor country. It used to be one of the key parts of the British Empire. So did Australia. So did, in fact, China. So did large parts of the world. In fact, most of Africa was the colony of a European power. The Spanish in Latin America, the Portuguese in Brazil, the Germans less so, but French and English in Africa. So all of those countries at one time or another were colonies. And sociologists would go, or their suspicions would be raised and say, well, there's some connection between being poor and being a colony. And Australia will be an exception. Australia is a former colony but also rich, so why did that happen? What's different about Australia in relation to that? What else would we notice if we looked at the structure? What would you notice about the racial structure of poverty, for instance? Predominantly, the poor people in the world are poor brown people, brown and black people. So there's a racial element to the structure of poverty, and a racial, in my view, quite a racist element to many of the solutions that are posed to poverty. And so we say, that there's too many. When we say there are too many poor people, we mean too many brown and black people, not too many white people. When in fact, if we looked at the solution, does the actual environmental impact occur? That's in the overconsumption of Western industrial society. So if we were going to eliminate populations, it would be far better to eliminate the much smaller population of North America than the much larger one of Asia in terms of the environmental impact. But of course that's never suggested, because white people don't suggest their own annihilation, but often the implication of a lot of population research is that there's too many poor brown and black people. So it's quite a racialised answer to the question. Gender too, if we looked at poverty, and that doesn't matter whether it's a third world question or not, poverty is always female. Wherever men are illiterate, women will be more illiterate. Wherever men are poor, women will be poorer. Now that doesn't mean that everyone living in India is poor, or that no women do okay. But as a broad social pattern, women will be at the bottom of any of those sort of hierarchies. And so we want to say there are connections here. There are all sorts of connections. It's not just a historical accident that colonies ended up poor, and it's not just a historical accident that certain countries are poor and certain countries are rich. Those two things are connected to each other. It's a result of exploitation. It actually looks at the way our lives and perceptions are shaped by the society in which we live, how it differs between people and different groups. It questions what's normal and what's common sense, and what we do, what we do and how we do it. We do that by trying to get you to see that we're all looking at the world through a lens of some kind. The lens distorts our vision to some extent, and so we need to reflect on how it is that we see the world, and who the we might be in that question. And through whose eyes are we looking a lot of the time when we look at the media? Whose eyes is that? And when we say we, who do we mean? We is an important ideological word. Right? The we creates a boundary, because wherever there's a we, then there's a them. Wherever there's an I, there's another, a self and another. So it's important to, tune your ear to listening for we. Where is that boundary? When I say we think a certain way, do I mean people at SOCL Uni? Do I mean white people? Do I mean white men of my age? Do I mean university lecturers? What community I'm implicitly referring to? And where is the boundary? Where's the other? If it's not we, then who's the them? Sociologists try to systematically challenge those lenses. Right? We have different theories, different lenses we try to use to understand the world. And we try to make our assumptions more explicit. So I'm not in the business of trying to convince you to adopt my position. I don't want you to believe what I believe. What I want you to see is that you have a position. That what you believe is not neutral and objective and common sense, but it is a result of socialisation, a result of your experience, and a result of the things you've been taught, as much by the matrix as by anything else. Some of you will have reflected more on your experience, but it's an important part of sociology to reflect on your assumptions and to understand how they work. And if I can get you to deepen your own understanding of your own assumptions and your own way of seeing the world, then we will have achieved something in this course. You'll understand yourself better, and you'll understand the world better using the sociological imagination. Sociology is different. The focus is on groups and on patterns, not on individual minds and not on biology. We try to take private troubles and understand them as public issues. We don't believe many things are purely private. The social isn't out there. The social is as much in you as it is out there, and we need to understand that. All private troubles, if you're doing social work or psychology, anybody who reports to you a private problem will have a public aspect. And we think it's important to address those public aspects. The beauty myth I already mentioned, aspects of health and gender are all implicated in the way we think about beauty. I talked about unemployment and class. We can see unemployment as a personal problem, but we need to see it in a broader social context. We have rising rates of depression in Western societies, which we tend to treat with drugs, and so there's a whole range of cultural issues going on there. One is to individualise the problem. This person has a problem with depression, not there's something broader going on in society. Particularly young people have rising rates of suicide. Why is that occurring? Well, it isn't just because they're becoming sicker. Our tendency is to want to treat that with drugs, to medicalise it, and that may have an important role in dealing with the issue, but it's a distinctly Western cultural form, and of course plugs into broader, big pharmaceutical companies have an interest in promoting these drugs, and they're very profitable, so that's an important part of the picture. What we don't use is individual choice. We don't talk about individual choice. That's not a sociological explanation. Individual choice only operates at a certain level. If I said to you, I broke up with my wife, and you said, well, why did she leave you? And I said, because she chose to, that doesn't really explain anything. That's just a description of what occurred. Of course you would go, yes, well, I understood that she left you. What I wanted to know was why. And if any explanation beyond that will require some sociological understanding or some social understanding, most of which we'll just treat as common sense. So if I said, well, because she found someone who was more attractive than me, you wouldn't then ask me probably what I meant by more attractive, because we speak a common language and we live in a common society, so I would understand what you meant, broadly speaking, about what was likely to be found as more attractive. So the minute we get out of that individual choice thing, we are talking in terms of a set of social norms that we all understand to some extent. We're already sophisticated social actors. We already are, proto-sociologists. We just we aren't given the tools and the opportunity to reflect like we'll have in this course to see that bigger picture. The other thing that sociology, as a cultural feature of sociology, we don't like to blame victims. We find individual explanations blame the victim. They say that the problem lies in the individual, and we want to make it clear that the problem is in a much broader social context. So we don't look to individuals or to poor and marginalised people as the cause of their own problems. Of course, being poor and marginalised may bring a set of problems with it, and people's behaviour might be dysfunctional, but in that context. But the first thing to see is the broader context. So sociology is a toolkit. Most of you won't become sociologists in a professional sense, although there are plenty of opportunities outside of uni, but not with a tag sociologist on them. So it's about critical thinking, which is what you need to have good conversations with people. Right? It means taking the perspective of others, of understanding society is plural and diverse, and seeing through your own position, to recognise that that's what you're doing, and to learn to try to take the position of others. We question common sense. We don't think the world is what it appears to be. Just like in the Matrix, everything seems to be fine, but in fact there's a whole lot more going on that people are unaware of. And that skill set applies to a whole range of jobs in the private and public sector. So as in the Matrix, where Neo is asked at a certain point to take the red pill or the blue pill, if he takes the blue pill, then he wakes up back in the Matrix, unaware that anything has happened, and life continues. Or he takes the red pill, in which case he gets to understand better what is really going on in his society, what is really happening in the real world. But to do that, you've got to ask questions. So don't come to me looking for answers, right, to copy down. It's not a textbook issue like that. I want you to ask questions, especially about what is taken as common sense. It's a different way of looking at the world. It can be confusing and confronting and difficult to understand, especially in the early stages. But it is also a very rewarding and important perspective to develop. Thanks.